on the first Google results, scroll to the bottom, you can find these lecture slides. Let me thank everybody who's involved in putting together the Young Philosophers Lecture Series, especially the Fredonia Philosophical Society. I've had a really great time here. I think this is an excellent lecture series that you've put together, so thanks for letting me be a part of it. So as Dr. Cullison said, I'm visiting from Pepperdine University, where the high temperature today is in the low to mid-60s. Chance of snow, 0%. But the probability of irreversible skin damage due to sun exposure is much higher than it is here. So it's nice to be here. The title of my talk is the Elsewhen Objection to Religious Belief. So I'll start by trying to introduce you to the problem that I'm interested in. It's a sort of argument against the rationality of religious belief. So what we'll do is we'll look at some examples of the objection, and then we'll try to sharpen it into a nice, clear, compelling argument. We'll look at 4 different ways in which you might do that, 4 versions of the argument. And along the way, I'll raise some concerns about each version of the argument. And what we'll try to do is, by the end, we'll try to see if there is a compelling statement of this argument, a version of this argument that really does substantially challenge the rationality of religious belief. Spoiler alert, I don't think there is one. So we could start with a true story. This is a true story about me. I was raised in a very devout Lutheran household, Missouri Synod Lutheran. You might know what that means. Both my parents were Lutheran. But one day I wondered, why is it that the Cuban side of my family, which you might suspect has a lot of Catholicism in the past, why is it that the Cuban side of my family ended up Lutheran? Why did my mom end up Lutheran? Because that sort of shaped a lot of the religious beliefs I had growing up. We went to the Lutheran educational system up through high school. And I asked my grandmother why she raised my mom Lutheran. And she said it was because when my mother was young and they were living in Chicago, the Lutheran church was the nearest church to their house. I found that sort of staggering to realize that if my grandparents had just decided to move a little bit in a different place in Chicago, I might have easily been raised Catholic. So that induced a certain sense of intellectual vertigo, and probably something like this is true of you as well. Some beliefs that you hold really tightly, some beliefs that you really cherish, are probably infected with this sort of accidentality in the past. I've actually known some people who were raised by parents with 2 different views on religious matters. One parent non-religious, one parent religious, and the parents actually decided how to raise the child based on a coin flip. So imagine finding that out. You're like 18 years old, you have these beliefs about religious matters that are very important to you, and you realize if that coin had fallen differently, I likely would have had very different beliefs about religious topics. So you might think that's a serious problem. And that's roughly the problem I want to look at. So here are some more careful statements of the problem from professional philosophers. Here's one from John Hick from the 90s. Here's how he put the argument. He's actually an interesting story. He was raised a traditional kind of Christian and actually started his philosophical career as a very traditional sort of Christian. But then these types of reflections convinced him to give up his religious beliefs. So here's the sort of reflection that caused him to become a religious skeptic. He said, religious allegiance depends in the great majority of cases on the accident of birth. Someone born into a devout Muslim family in Pakistan is very likely to be a Muslim. Someone born into a devout Hindu family in India to be a Hindu. Someone born into a devout Christian family in Spain or Mexico to be a Catholic Christian, and so on. He says, the conclusion I've drawn is that a hermeneutic of suspicion is appropriate in relation to beliefs that have been instilled into one by the surrounding religious culture. So I take it we have an argument here, and the conclusion is clear enough. I mean, it's clear that the conclusion's happening here. He thinks that the right response to these sorts of considerations is to be suspicious of one's religious beliefs. And it's not clear exactly what that means, but again, in his own life, that meant give up your religious beliefs. So just a few things to note before we move on. Notice the emphasis on an accident of birth here. It's going to be important later. It seems like people who present this sort of argument do want to emphasize the accidental nature of many of our beliefs about religious topics. They could have easily gone otherwise. And I think to help us see that, he asks us to consider the geographical variation of religious belief. Now, he doesn't invite us to imagine being born elsewhere and elsewhen, but the implication's clear enough. You can imagine yourself having been born into a devout Muslim family in Pakistan. You likely would have been Muslim. If you've been born into a devout Hindu family in India, you likely would have been Hindu. And so, again, these seem to be the premises. But it's also important to point out that it seems important here that he has his targets set on a certain kind of religious belief. He thinks that in the vast majority of cases, religious beliefs are instilled into people by the surrounding religious culture. So it's sort of a passive process that he has in mind, where you just accept what you're told as a child. And I think that's right. That is a common way of gaining beliefs about religious topics. Okay, here's another statement of the argument, this one from 2010 from Philip Kitcher. He calls this the symmetry argument, and it goes like this. He says, most Christians have adopted their doctrines much as polytheists and the ancestor worshippers have acquired theirs, through early teaching and socialization. So again, it looks like we have our target set on a certain way of producing religious beliefs, being taught them as a child, being socialized into them, typically when you're young. So he thinks that sort of way of producing religious beliefs is problematic. And to help us see why it's problematic, like Hick, he asks us to consider this counterfactual. Had the Christians been born among the Aboriginal Australians, they would believe in just the same ways, on just the same bases, and with just the same convictions, doctrines about dreamtime instead of about the resurrection. Dreamtime is a religious belief of the Aboriginal Australians. And so again, the idea is if you'd been born elsewhere and elsewhen, which easily might have happened, you would have had very different, conflicting religious beliefs. Beliefs that, from your current perspective, you judge to be false. And that's supposed to be the problem. It's supposed to help us reach this conclusion. He says the symmetry is complete. Given that they're all on a par, we should trust none of them. So again, we're meant to reach this skeptical conclusion about our religious beliefs. We shouldn't trust our religious beliefs. And again, the reason is clear enough. Something about entertaining this thought. If we'd been born elsewhere and elsewhen, we'd have different religious beliefs. So I gave you two contemporary statements of the argument, but it's important to point out that this is a very old argument. It's as old as the hills, as they say. You can find it in the ancient Greeks, you can find it in the Romans, you can find it in some of the medievals, and even among the modern philosophers. You find it all through the history of philosophy. But I gave you some contemporary statements because they're, I think, the clearest. So what we'll do now is we'll try to understand how this argument is supposed to go. We'll try to understand exactly what the premises are supposed to be and how we're supposed to get to this skeptical conclusion. So here's the simplest way one might run the argument. You can call this the bare counterfactual argument. So I take it that the problem is supposed to be that certain considerations are meant to defeat our claims to religious knowledge. So I think the argument we're supposed to reach is that we can't really know that our religious beliefs are true. Our religious beliefs don't really count as genuine knowledge. These considerations are meant to provide a defeater for religious knowledge. So suppose the argument is very swift. It just moves straight from this counterfactual to the conclusion. If you'd been born and raised elsewhere, elsewhen, you would have had different religious beliefs. So I think you could be excused for interpreting the arguments that we just read in this way. And one famous philosopher did interpret Hick in this way. Alvin Plantinga interpreted John Hick's argument to be just this bare counterfactual argument. And Plantinga gave a few objections, but in the interest of time, I'll just share one that I thought was most important. Plantinga pointed out that, hey, religious skepticism isn't and hasn't been widely popular in the world at large. And it's true of the skeptic that if he or she had been born elsewhere and elsewhen, he or she wouldn't have been a skeptic. Right? This is true of even John Hick. If John Hick had been born into a devout Muslim family in Pakistan, he would have been a Muslim. So the point, I take it, is supposed to be that this argument is a bit dangerous. It threatens to turn on whoever wields it. It threatens self-defeat. Because consider someone who thinks this is a good argument, thinks this is a sound argument, and has some beliefs about religious topics. Well, it looks like the premise is still true even of that person, even of someone like John Hick or Philip Kitcher. The premise is still true of them. If they'd been born and raised elsewhere and Elsewhen, they would have had different beliefs about religious topics. So if they think this is a good inference, the argument that they themselves endorse seems to recommend that they give up their own religious beliefs. And in fact, if you could just consider the belief that this argument is sound, just consider that belief, this argument is sound. That belief too seems to vary in this way. If you've been born elsewhere and Elsewhen, you wouldn't have had that belief. So it looks like this argument itself tells you that you shouldn't believe the argument is sound. And that would be bad. Because then if it's sound, it tells you you shouldn't believe it's sound. And of course, if it isn't sound, you shouldn't believe it's sound either. So either way, you might think you should conclude that this argument isn't sound. So John Hick has a response to this. I think Hick's response is underappreciated, and I think it's ultimately successful, but at a cost. Here's the response. He says, oh, all this is true, but how relevant is it? One is not usually a religious skeptic as a result of having been raised from childhood to be one. So here John Hick reminds us that really the target of this argument was just meant to be certain kinds of religious beliefs, ones that have been instilled into someone through early teaching and socialization. And so Hick tells us, hey, his religious beliefs aren't like that. He didn't just absorb them from childhood. His beliefs about religious topics were the product of reflection. His beliefs are reflective, you might say. And so I think what Hick is telling us here is we should narrow the scope of this first premise. It's really just meant to apply to a certain way of forming beliefs, which you might call an unreflective way, just absorbing it from your environment. That's supposed to be the problem. And so he's trying to carve a loophole into this first premise so that his reflective, skeptical beliefs can slip through. So I think that will work. I mean, that will avoid the charge of self-defeat. I think the lesson is that though whoever wants to wield this argument should appeal to the method of belief formation. That'll help this argument not be self-defeating. But as I said, it comes at a cost. I think reflective religious beliefs are also off the hook then. If Hick carves a loophole into premise one so that his reflective religious beliefs can get out, his reflective skeptical beliefs can escape premise one won't apply to them, I think that the reflective religious believer could, with equal plausibility, slip through that same loophole. The argument will no longer apply to reflective religious believers. And I take it that applies to anyone listening to this lecture. If you're listening to this lecture, you are now reflecting on your religious beliefs. You've joined the ranks of reflective religious believers. So you are now off the hook of this revised argument. So you might think that's a cost. You might have thought that this argument was supposed to cast a wide net, apply to all religious believers, but in order to avoid self-defeat, we've got to narrow the scope of the argument to just the unreflective religious believers. So what I'd like to do now is try to make the revisions suggested by Hick, try to understand the first premise as an attack on a certain method of belief formation. There's supposed to be something wrong with the way in which many people form their religious beliefs, this unreflective method. And I think maybe the best way to go is to think about a virtue of belief formation that philosophers have called safety. So a lot of philosophers have thought that in order for a belief of yours to count as knowledge, the method that you used has to be, in a certain important sense, safe. So to help you see what that means, consider tarot cards. These are tarot cards. And I take it that tarot cards are a really terrible way to form beliefs about anything. Especially, for example, important financial decisions. You shouldn't consult tarot cards for important financial decisions, but suppose you went to all the trouble of getting the cards, you've got the special gloves, so you just go for it. You consult the tarot cards, they tell you the market's going to crash tomorrow. You pull all your investments out of the market, and suppose the tarot cards were right, the market did crash, and so you got lucky. I take it that even if you form a true belief on the basis of tarot cards, you can't properly be said to have known that the market would crash. You just got lucky. And the reason is, tarot cards are so unreliable. They're such a risky way of forming beliefs. They could so easily give you a false belief that even if they managed to strike upon the truth, it wouldn't count as genuine knowledge. So maybe that's supposed to be the problem with religious belief. Maybe the problem is supposed to be that safety is required for knowledge. You can know something only if the method you use wouldn't easily mislead you. And maybe all these counterfactuals that we're considering about being born elsewhere and elsewhen are meant to get us to believe that the method that many people use to form religious beliefs could have easily misled them. If they'd just been born elsewhere and elsewhen, they would have formed radically different religious beliefs, beliefs that they would now judge to be false. So maybe that's how the argument should go. We can call this the safety argument. So the first premise could be something like this. If you've been born and raised elsewhere and elsewhen and formed your religious beliefs using the same method that you actually used, well then, by your own lights, you easily might have believed falsely. You easily might have believed falsely. The method could have easily misled you. And so you might think, that premise shows us that our religious beliefs were formed unsafely. They weren't formed safely. And if you think that safety is required for knowledge, you can get to the conclusion that hey, that's why your religious beliefs aren't knowledge, because they weren't formed safely. Okay, so that's the safety version of the argument. And to be honest, I think this is probably what Hick and Kitcher had in mind. I think this is perhaps the most charitable interpretation of the texts that we read earlier. But I want to say a few things about the argument. First, remember that we're restricting premise 1 to just a certain kind of method, a method that could easily mislead you. We're meant to understand that method as the one that's used just by unreflective religious believers. To avoid the charge of self-defeat, we mean to pick out that method used by unreflective religious believers, those who just accept early teaching and socialization. So just a reminder, reflective religious believers are off the hook of this argument. But does the argument create problems even for unreflective religious believers? I think it doesn't. I think that the argument is doubly unsound. I think both inferences fail. So consider that first inference from premise 1 to premise 2. Premise 1 basically tells us that something could have happened in the past that would have put you at risk of forming a false belief. Something could have happened in your past that would have made it such that the method you used to acquire religious beliefs could have misled you. You would have been at risk. Does it follow from that that you actually were at risk when you formed your religious beliefs? That you actually did use a method that could have easily misled you? I don't think it follows. And here's an example to help you see why. I'm going to describe a scenario in which this is true, premise 1 is true, and yet the conclusion we're meant to draw from it is false. So I'm going to try to describe a scenario where this is true and this is false, and that'll help you see why the move from 1 to 2 is invalid. So suppose that an evil epistemologist has poisoned the world's water supplies with a chemical that really messes up your cognitive faculties. Just makes you hallucinate all the time. So your eyes, your ears, all your senses will be really badly damaged by this chemical. You'll just have constant hallucinations and no belief that you form about the external environment will be true. So there's this chemical in the water, everybody's in danger. But suppose that you got lucky in the maternity ward. A benevolent nurse inoculated you with his only vial of antidote. It was the only one he had. He gave it to you. You got lucky. So you're now immune to this chemical. You can drink all the water you want. Nothing's going to happen to your cognitive faculties. So you go around living life much as you're living life now. Nothing bad has happened to your faculties. I take it that in this scenario, your beliefs about the external environment are formed safely. They're formed in exactly the same way you're actually forming beliefs about the external world. Surely, the beliefs you're forming about the external world now are safe. So likewise, they should be safe in this hypothetical scenario. So 2 is false of you in this hypothetical scenario. Your beliefs are formed safely. 2 is false. But premise 1 is true, given the way I set up the scenario. With respect to beliefs about the external environment, if you had been born and raised elsewhere and elsewhen, and formed beliefs about the external world using the same method you actually used, then you easily might have believed falsely. Because if you'd been born elsewhere and elsewhen, you wouldn't have gotten this antidote from that benevolent nurse. You would have been just like everybody else. So in this scenario, 1 is true, but 2 is false. So that shows that 1 doesn't entail 2. I also think that 2 doesn't entail 3. Let me quickly tell you why. So I don't think that safety is required for knowledge. And here's an example to help you see why. Suppose you've got the world's most accurate watch strapped to your wrist. It's an atomic clock, so it relies for its accuracy on a very clever little sensor that detects subtle changes in cesium atoms or something. I don't really know how atomic clocks work, but I do know that atomic clocks could easily be disrupted if a radioactive isotope were to decay in the area. So let's suppose that this is the world's most accurate watch, but if a radioactive isotope were to decay in the area, it would be disrupted and it would freeze, and it would no longer be a reliable way of forming beliefs about the time. Now suppose that there is a radioactive isotope in the area, suppose this is it, and it's due to decay. It's going to decay at any moment, but it hasn't decayed yet. It hasn't decayed yet. This continues to be the world's most accurate watch. I take it that you can come to know what time it is on the basis of the world's most accurate watch. So long as this thing hasn't decayed yet, nothing's gone wrong. But notice that although you can come to know what time it is on the basis of this watch, the method that you're using is in serious danger of becoming unreliable. If this thing just decays, then your watch will no longer be reliable. So that shows that safety isn't required for knowledge. You can form a belief about the time in this scenario that's not formed safely. It is vulnerable to going awry very easily. And yet, nevertheless, you can come to know what time it is on the basis of this clock. So that shows that 2 doesn't entail 3. So let's try another version of the argument. And I think if we set aside these considerations about safety, I think we can pick up on something else that John Hicks said. He said that religious beliefs are often due to an accident of birth. An accident of birth. And that's a nice way of putting the point. Maybe the problem is supposed to be the sheer amount of accidentality that was involved in the production of our religious beliefs. So again, in my own case, if my grandparents had just moved to a different house, I would have had different religious beliefs. In other people's cases, if the coin flip had come up slightly differently, they would have had different beliefs about religious topics. So maybe we should pick up on the accidental nature of many of our beliefs about religious topics. Because some philosophers have thought that knowledge is incompatible with a certain kind of accidentality. So here's an example to help you see why. Suppose you really love surfing on the Great Lakes or something. You really do that. People do. I don't know why, but they do. Suppose you really love surfing, but not as much as your roommate loves his significant other. And your roommate's significant other is coming over to visit in a few hours, and your roommate wants you out. So your roommate tells you, hey, there's going to be really good waves today, you should go surfing. And you're like, oh, cool, where will there be really good waves? And he's like, wherever, just get out. Just pick a beach, there's going to be really good waves there. Suppose you believe him, and you go look for waves, and unbeknownst to him, there really will be good waves today, and you find some. So you manage to gain a true belief from your roommate's testimony. But most people think that you didn't really know that there would be good waves today because your roommate didn't intend to get you to have a true belief. Your roommate just wanted you out. That his testimony happened to be true was just an accidental byproduct. He wasn't aiming at the truth. The fact that he hit the truth, that was just an accident. So that's why you can't really come to know if there were good waves on the basis of his testimony. Of course, when you see the good waves, then you can know. But we're thinking about before you actually see them, would that true belief count as knowledge? So some philosophers, for example, Peter Unger, back in 1968, have given this analysis of knowledge. They say you can know that something's true just in case it's not at all accidental that you're right about its being true. Not at all accidental that you're right. So let me just clarify a few things. Unger understands that there can be accidents in the neighborhood of knowledge. You might accidentally stumble upon some really good evidence for something. A detective might stumble upon the murder weapon and nevertheless know on that basis who committed the murder. So it's all right if you accidentally come by some evidence. That doesn't preclude knowledge. And it's all right if the proposition that you know is true by accident. You might witness a car accident and come to know, oh, those cars crashed. That proposition is true by accident. It was a car accident. But nevertheless, you can still know that it's true. So it's all right if the proposition is true by accident, and it's all right if you're in a position to know that it's true by accident. What's incompatible with knowledge is, as Unger says, that there be any accidentality between the man and the fact, he said. Between the man and the fact. It can't be an accident that you're right given the evidence that you have. That can't be an accident. So maybe we should understand the Elsewhen objection as trying to point us to this condition on knowledge, a non-accidentality condition. So here's the way the argument might go. Again, we get this counterfactual. If you've been born and raised elsewhere, elsewhen, and formed religious beliefs using the same method you actually used, then by your own lights you easily might have believed falsely, could have been misled. The fact that you were right, it seems to be to some degree an accident. So maybe that's what we should conclude from this counterfactual. It's accidental that you're right about your religious beliefs, or you're not right at all. Either way, you don't know that your religious beliefs are true. Your religious beliefs don't really amount to knowledge. So maybe that's the right way to understand the argument. Instead of trying to go through safety, let's go through accidentality. So again, let's just remember that we're going to restrict this first premise to just particular kinds of methods, early teaching and socialization, unreflective religious beliefs. Reflective religious believers, remember, are off the hook, so that the skeptic avoids the charge of self-defeat. Still, though, I don't think this argument should worry even unreflective religious believers, because I think that this argument, too, is doubly unsound. I think both inferences fail. Consider this inference. Again, the first premise tells us that something could have happened in the past that would have put you at risk of forming a false belief. And then we're meant to conclude, oh, therefore it's accidental that you're right. It's accidental in the bad kind of way. There's accidentality between the man and the fact, as Unger said. So I don't think that follows, and here's a case to help you see why. I'll try to describe a scenario again where this is true, but this is false. This is true, but this is false. And that'll help you see that 2 doesn't follow from 1. So imagine you are an elderly friend of Copernicus in Fromberg in 1515. So he's amassed an impressive body of data that justifies belief in heliocentrism, but he hasn't shared it with the world yet. For fear of ecclesiastical reprisals, he won't share it with the world for a couple decades. So you're in a unique position. You've got access to data that nobody else has access to, except Copernicus and this small group of friends. It seems like you can come to know that heliocentrism is true on the basis of this data. It's not an accident that you're right. It's sort of an accident that you were friends with Copernicus and that you got this evidence. But that's okay. It's not an accident that you're right, given the evidence that you do have. All right, so 2 is false of you. It's not an accident that you're right in this case. And yet 1 is true of you. Something could have happened in the past that would have put you at risk of forming a false belief about heliocentrism. Again, you're an elderly friend of Copernicus, and he didn't have very many friends, let's say. If you had been born and raised elsewhere, elsewhen, and formed beliefs about astronomy using the same method you actually use, namely expert testimony, consulting the data, and so on, if you'd been born elsewhere and elsewhen, you wouldn't have known Copernicus. You could have easily been misled by all the misleading data that was out there at the time. You could have easily come to believe geocentrism. So 1 is true of you. Something could have happened that would have put you at risk of forming a false belief about heliocentrism. But it doesn't follow that you were right by accident in this case. Because again, you had access to really good data. So 1 is true, but 2 is false. So that shows that 1 doesn't entail 2. More controversially, I think that 2 doesn't entail 3. I don't think that knowledge is incompatible with accidentality. I think there can be cases of accidental knowledge. So let me quickly try to sketch an argument for you to show you that there can be accidental knowledge and to show you that 2 doesn't entail 3. This argument involves a creature of philosophical fiction called Swamp Man. Are you familiar with Swamp Man? Or Swamp Woman? Swamp Person? Swamp Person. Swamp Person doesn't really look like this. Swamp Person is a metaphysical, microphysical duplicate of you. A microphysical duplicate of you. Formed by lightning striking a swamp and rearranging the molecules in an admittedly very improbable way, but a possible way. Lightning strikes a swamp, rearranges the molecules, forms a perfect microphysical duplicate of you. So what does swamp person look like? Looks just like this. What does swamp person sound like? Just like this. If you ask swamp person, how long have you been around? He'll say like, oh, 31 years, I've been here for a long time. When really he's been here for like 20 minutes or so. So that's swamp person, formed by chance, by the random rearrangement of particles in a swamp. Now consider this premise. This premise is meant to be the lesson we learned from that surfing story. If you form a true belief on the basis of a report that wasn't aimed at the truth, then you're right by accident. Your true belief is true by accident, the bad kind of accident. Remember, your roommate wasn't interested in the truth. That his testimony should hit the truth without being aimed at the truth would be an accident. And I think Peter Unger himself is committed to this premise because he endorses stories like that surfing story. But his involved rose bushes, so I gave you a more interesting version. Now consider this premise. Swamp man's faculties, I'm thinking about my own case, but it's just a swamp person. Swamp man's faculties aren't aimed at the truth. They're not aimed at the truth or anything else. Swamp man was not designed by God or evolution or anything else. His faculties, his eyes and his ears, all of his senses, all of his ways of forming beliefs were not aimed at the truth. They weren't designed to deliver truth. He was produced by accident, by random chance. So I think it follows from 1 and 2 that if swamp man could ever come to know something, his knowledge would be accidental. Because if he ever comes to have a true belief on the basis of his faculties, that belief will be true by accident. And so if any of those true beliefs ever amounts to knowledge, well, premise 1 tells us it'll be this kind of case. It'll be a true belief that's true by accident. So if we could just prove that a swamp person could know something, we'll prove that accidental knowledge is possible. That knowledge doesn't preclude accidentality. So let me now try to convince you that a swamp person could know something. Here's the argument. Consider the proposition in your own personal case. The proposition that I am swamp man. So I'm going to think about that proposition in my case. Hey, I'm swamp man. You think about it in your own case. Think about you being swamp man or swamp woman. That proposition is consistent with everything I know from the armchair, as philosophers say. Everything I know a priori. All the propositions I know that are consistent with, for example, Descartes' evil demon hypothesis. All the propositions I could still continue to know, even supposing that there's an evil demon who is exerting all of his efforts to deceive me. So put together all those propositions, all the things you could know that are demon-proof, that are a priori. I think that the proposition that I'm swamp man is consistent with all of those propositions. I can't rule out the swamp man hypothesis a priori from the armchair. This is an empirical hypothesis that I'm swamp man. I couldn't know what happened in the past without actually doing some empirical investigation. I couldn't know it a priori. So that's what 4 says. That proposition is consistent with all the propositions I know from the armchair. But the proposition that I know nothing is inconsistent with all those propositions I know from the armchair. There's at least some propositions I know from the armchair that are inconsistent with the proposition that I know nothing. For example, here's just one example. You can know a priori that you exist. I think you can also know that you know that you exist. So this is a very old thought, going back to at least St. Augustine. You can know not only that you exist, but you can know that you exist. So one of the propositions in that long conjunction of all the propositions you can know from the armchair entails that you know something. So that you know nothing is inconsistent with all the propositions you know from the armchair. And it's going to follow from 4 and 5 that it's possible that I'm swamp man and I know something. This proposition that I'm swamp man is, it's possible for that proposition to be true while also I know something. That follows from 4 and 5. I've checked it about 25 times, just to be sure that I'm not making some modal fallacy here. But I'm pretty sure that's a legit move from 4 and 5 to 6. Now put 3 and 6 together. Remember, 3 told us that if we could prove a swamp man could know something, then we'd show that accidental knowledge is possible. Well, we just proved that a swamp man could know something. I could be that swamp man. So it's going to follow that accidental knowledge is possible. So again, the point of all this was to show you, in the accidentality argument, even if we could prove that our religious beliefs are true by accident, in the allegedly bad kind of accidental way, it wouldn't follow that our religious beliefs don't amount to knowledge, because accidental knowledge is possible. Okay, one last attempt at sharpening the Elsewhen objection. And then we'll stop. Just one last attempt. I think we could pick up on something that Kitcher said. He called his argument the argument from symmetry, and he tried to convince us that all the evidence we have for our religious beliefs is sort of on a par, or perfectly balanced by the evidence that Aboriginal Australians have for their religious beliefs. They have the same sort of bases, the same sort of methods, the same type of evidence for their religious beliefs that we have for ours. So there's sort of what you might call symmetry. This is actually a picture of one of my philosophy classes. We do a little warm-up exercise before one of our classes. Here we are at the beginning of the class. So let's call this the symmetry. I'm just kidding. Here's what you might call the symmetry argument. You might think, here's what those counterfactuals are supposed to show us. Religious disagreement involves a certain kind of evidential symmetry. The evidence that you have for your religious beliefs is sort of balanced by the evidence that other people have for their religious beliefs, or at least it's unclear whose evidence is better. It's often unclear whose evidence is better. And you might think that just saying, well, my evidence is mine, can't really break the tie. You shouldn't just side with your view because it happens to be yours. That's arbitrary. You shouldn't do that. So what would the tiebreaker be? It's unclear who has better evidence, that your evidence is yours, can't reasonably break the tie. So it looks like maybe that's what gets us into trouble. Because in the event of a tie, you might think you can't really know who's right. Can't really know who's right. If it's unclear who has better evidence, whose view is better supported, and you can't break the tie, then it would be unreasonable to just insist that you know you're right. So let's put the argument a little more carefully. Again, we could start with this counterfactual. If you've been born and raised elsewhere, elsewhen, and formed religious beliefs using that same method you actually used, well then you easily could have formed different religious beliefs. So there are counterfactual versions of you in other possible worlds that were born and raised elsewhere, elsewhen, came to have different religious beliefs. And they have a body of evidence in favor of that religious belief, which seems somehow in balance with the evidence you actually have for your religious beliefs. It's unclear whose evidence is better. And let's add for good measure that this is true not just with respect to counterfactual versions of you, but it's true with respect to actual people, many who've actually been born and raised elsewhere, elsewhen, and formed religious beliefs, using the same method you actually used to form different religious beliefs. Maybe this was Hick's point, when Hick didn't actually use the counterfactual, he just said, you know, people who were born in India tend to be Hindus, people who were born in Pakistan tend to be Muslims. So maybe he just meant to point out there's a lot of actual disagreement. So let's throw that in for good measure. There's a lot of symmetry around, not just in the actual world, but in possible worlds as well. And let's add, which seems true, that it's at least sometimes, and in fact very often, unclear whether you're in a better epistemic position than either those counterfactual selves who disagree with you or those actual people who disagree with you. Sometimes it's unclear whose evidence is better. You don't have access to their evidence. You can't evaluate it. You don't know whether it's better or worse than your evidence. So there's a sort of symmetry here, and it's hard to see what would break the tie. And so you might think from 1, 2, and 3, just put them all together and put them through the grinder and get this conclusion. That's why your religious beliefs don't count as knowledge, because there's all this symmetry, and there's no good tiebreaker. Okay, so just in closing, let me say a couple things about this argument. First, I mean, you might be concerned, as we have been for the first part of this talk, you might be concerned with self-defeat issues. How is the religious skeptic going to respond to this argument? Will this argument turn on whoever wields it? Will it defeat whoever tries to use it? Yeah, you might wonder about that. What's the religious skeptic going to say? The religious skeptic might say, as Hick did, well, my religious beliefs, or my beliefs about religious matters are reflective. I didn't just absorb them from my culture, I thought about it. I used rational intuition, deliberation, and so on. Well, even if that's true, what premise are they going to deny? Either one, any one of the premises comes with a cost to deny. Well, let's just suppose that the reflective religious skeptic can plausibly deny one premise. Again, I think the reflective religious believer can, with equal plausibility, deny that premise. So maybe, for example, the religious skeptic will say, hey, it's not unclear whether I'm in a better position than these people who disagree with me. I can see that I'm in a better position because, as I said, I'm very reflective. I can just see that I'm right. Again, I don't know if this is plausible, but that's one way you could go. And I think the religious believer, the reflective religious believer, could make the same move with equal plausibility. So again, I think reflective religious believers are off the hook, or the argument's self-defeating. I think we can say something even in defense of unreflective religious believers, namely this. I think that rationality can't require you to respond to considerations that you're non-culpably unaware of. If you're just unaware of certain considerations, rationality can't condemn you as irrational. So consider a really unreflective religious believer, just warm in the pews, just accepting what he or she's told from testimony, early teaching and socialization. If that unreflective religious believer is unaware of these considerations, I don't see how we could condemn that religious believer as being irrational, as not actually knowing that his or her religious beliefs are true, because he's unaware of these considerations. And suppose he hasn't neglected study of religion in a blameworthy way. It's just, sort of simple-mindedly committed to these religious beliefs. I think those sorts of unreflective religious believers are not in danger of this argument. And I think, finally, this is the final point, if an unreflective religious believer considers this sort of argument, is made aware of these considerations, thinks about them, and somehow maintains his or her religious belief, he or she has now joined the ranks of the reflective religious believers. And so again, this argument no longer applies to that sort of religious believer. So I think we can say at least that in the face of this argument. So those were the 4 versions of the Elsewhen objection that I could think of. Tried my best to state the argument as clearly and as powerfully as possible. But all of the versions that I could come up with seem to have serious problems. So at the end of the day, I'm a little skeptical that there is a successful version of this argument. But thanks very much for your attention, and I'd be happy to take any questions that you might have.